I'm continuing what happened yesterday. I'm realizing that the Zoom space and Nova and I have this, we're squares, little boxes. And I'm like, how do we actually animate it as if we were in a space together, seeing each other? So I have a couple of suggestions that will start the day before I get into some of the review processes. And one is, I'm also coming to you on a digital transference from Treaty 13, which is Takaranto, the gathering place. It is the home, of course, as you know, the Wendat people, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, as was mentioned, but Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity, and thankful also to Indigenous bodies and peoples, persons, to have the opportunity to live, work, and play creatively on this land. I, in extension, want to call into focus and honor the Indigenous lands of the Americas and the Caribbean, and in particular the land of the Tainos that nurtured my being, on which I arrived at birth, known to you as Jamaica or Jamaica, land of wood and water. I want to also say that as I acknowledge the systems of oppression on this land, in particular the lives of BIPOC folks, I am mindful of the Indigenous teachings and philosophies, like Pam mentioned, that Laura Croft shared yesterday. And there's a power slide I was talking about in our pre-meeting that hopefully will be shared with everyone. It was absolutely amazing. Warren Garrett from Ontario Presents have been having this conversation around how do we center our creative practices with Indigenous teachings at the center. And that was that using the medicine wheel was an interesting way to think about it. It was so great. It was so impactful for me as an artist. I want to also say that, you know, they're mindful of the Indigenous teachings and philosophies like the Wampum Belt and the Dish with One Spoon, aimed at bringing us through diverse understandings into a shared and collective presence and opportunity. And I feel that the conversation we're going to have at this moment is an opportunity. It's an opportunity. People may run away from the idea of dismantling, but it's an opportunity to really think about and be in our discomfort about what are we dismantling and how do we begin from this space moving forward.
So much, Kevin. I'm happy to share. It's a ritual from my dance practice called a Namaskaram, and it's an invitation from one to many to go on a shared journey of the imagination. It's a performative ritual in the dance style, and it's really, I have evolved it to what Kevin is referring to, and that evolution has been entirely influenced by colleagues like Santee Smith, Brian Solomon, Duke Redbird, just so many different artists from so many different communities from Turtle Island who have generously shared learnings and practices and their ways of life. And yeah, so this is absolutely an evolution of a practice that started in India and traveled to Canada through the diaspora. So if you just start by feeling your connection to the earth, if it's your feet resting from the chair, if you want to stand, but to place your hand on your heart and listen to your heartbeat. And register if it's racing, if it's a bit sluggish. And as you breathe in and out, connecting yourself to the earth, calibrate that heartbeat and imagine the heartbeats of all the other 18 people on this call. And as you sync up to this heartbeat, find a moment to interject with a sound. And whatever that sound is, allow it to rain down and land on the pores of your skin and be absorbed into the skeletal structure of your body. And inhale through your feet and exhale through the crown of your head. And now, in whatever way you would like, make a circle around yourself, around the room, considering all directions, considering what you have to offer to the circle, and considering what you might learn from this circle. And now reach towards the screen, towards each other, using this moment to connect in space even when we can't be together. And remember that reaching out can be both a gesture of asking for help and offering it. Inhale through your fingertips, exhale through your entire body, and allow the weight of the air to reconnect you to the earth. And think about the earth as a mother, and think about our complicated relationships with our mother, and think about the beauty of this planet, and think about a sari of blue oceans and rivers covering the mother, and the trees that are her jewels, and the cities that are the concrete scabs we place upon her. Take a moment to imagine drawing something up from the earth and bringing it to your eyes, and asking for forgiveness for every action you take has an impact on the earth. And take this moment to acknowledge the land that you are on, its history, its present and its future, and think about taking actions that are kind, generous, and compassionate in the here and now. Another circle around your body to touch your fingertips above your head, and imagine unfurling your DNA chain through the galaxy and connecting yourself to the infinite universe. Allowing the weight of your wrists to bring your hands down to your forehead, and consider teachers and ancestors. And when you're thinking about teachers, thinking not only about those who have taught you skills or are conventional teachers of dance or theater or school, but also babies in strollers and the creatures of the land and blades of grass and what you can learn from them. Inhale through your forehead, exhale through your heart, bringing your hands back down to your heart, clocking where your heartbeat is now, connecting to our humanity, and connecting with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Nova. Yeah, where do I begin? Where do I begin after something like that? And in a conversation that is going to be so rich and so complicated and so nuanced and so evolving in terms of our practices and the ways we think about applications and so systems of support and what they are. Some things are already mentioned, and I wanted to bring up from yesterday. When I started the conversation today, some things that came up was that this is not a destination, but a journey. And as Lara Croft mentioned, that this is also, autumn is a time for movement. So allow the movement that was just offered to you in this particular practice that Nova offered to be that. Think of your heart space. And as I mentioned yesterday, think of also your breath space. And really find where we are sitting within those two things, and really allow us, before we go into the conversation, to think if we're thinking about our organizations that we may represent, or if we're thinking as individuals. And if we're responding, in what ways are we responding? I think those two things are also really important, because sometimes we work for organizations and we cannot separate the two. We feel that sometimes when we say things, we are saying it and representing the organization, but indeed in our innate self as individuals, we may realize that something may be awry and askew, but we are just caught up also with this idea of perception that if we say something, then it's going to go back to someone else and it's going to go, and it further complicates the things we're trying to address and the things we're trying to change and the ways we're trying to move things forward. I'm inviting some things that I mentioned yesterday from the Radical Welcome conversation. This one I got from Theater Center, and I love it when I was part of Stages Changes with them. Radical generosity. What does it look like in a conversation like this? Radical intent, radical action, radical implementation, radical performance, radical reorganizing principles, radical placement, and radical positionality. That's a lot of radicals. And I offer those because I think we're at an interesting moment where we get to impact and influence differently. The conference title, How Do We Begin Again, is exactly that. We're grappling with the ideas that we know are systemic, they're bureaucratic, they're colonial, they are structures that is providing strictures for BIPOC artists and arts organizations in particular. And we need to be really, really mindful of that. We really need to be mindful as well about what allyship means and what it means to actually understand systems so that we can then see how we can support what the shift and change is going to be. And so I want to be very clear and mindful that it's not about granting, right? It's not about those particular things. It's about systems of support. And it's also about, another Kevin is entering the room, and it's also about application processes, right? And how we rethink them so that they're actually influencing and supporting the persons who need them most and the persons who are able to access them through their own individual technologies in a different way. So I'll just read out some of what we're curious about unearthing in this particular conversation today. We're thinking about new funding models that need to include investing in artists and humans rather than investing primarily in constantly producing. And that came up yesterday. As the diversity of artists' presentations and processes increase, the current funding models and supporting models are still rooted in a colonial structural approach and may favor presentation culture, revenue generation culture in the arts. Often successful and sometimes not, the application and funding models have become a game of the haves and the have-not. It's further isolating particular artists rather than bringing artists, what our last conversation was, artists to the center of the conversation. And I think that its results impact both the well-being and validation of an artist's creativity. So we're curious about, are there shifts required in the application processes that can mitigate the challenges faced by so many who are applying to the application process? Are there possibilities that we know of? Are there things that we know of that can be documented, that can begin to shift the way in which application processes happen? As artists and as organizations, can we also begin to think about those things differently? Can we begin to influence how presenters may think about work? Are we be able to, because I think a lot of those things also arrive in a structure where, because it is coming from a structure that we know before, how do we begin again? And what are the things that we could start to implement in that particular reality? Some of the questions posed as part of the conversation, and I know Tamaj is here and could, if she can stay for the entire thing, can answer those things when I call on her, is what does a hybrid application process look like? Could that be implemented? Because people like me, and I know there's captioning, probably will never capture half of this. I'm really mindful of language diversity. So people like me want to do a video talk about the way language meets the rhythm that exists in my Afro-contemporary presentation of the Caribbean and Africa. We can't write about that because it's a long research. But we can talk about it and show a video and have a dancer explain it and show it in a different way. What exactly is involved in that for when we're in a process of an application? Is that even possible? You know, how can the process of applying assessments and feedback support artists for the future imaginations of a process? So I think the artists should be placed at the center, and their realities and the things that we know they are doing should be at the center. But it might also be part of a larger structure that is preventing it from actually arriving at that place. And I think that's a complicated, evolving shift that we are curious about speaking about. And what is involved in that? Again, as Liz Lerman would say, no question should lead to answers. They should lead to more questions. And so I'd like to open it because I do believe that one of the opportunities we have in these particular spaces is Zoom has done that, right? It has offered us now the capacity to just Zoom across the country. And instead of people traveling to Kitchener, Waterloo to be a part of the Impact Festival, we can just Zoom them in. So digital technology is also an important part of how we're thinking about systems of support and also the process. I want to start with Patty. And it's a great conversation because Patty was also part of the session we had before with CPAMO. I want to say that this is also a partnership with both Impact Festival, CPAMO, Mass Culture, and the Art of Festivals. I'm envisioning these particular 3 sessions where we're gathering information that will lead to a sort of report on the sessions for the next gathering multi-arts festival and conference that CPAMO will have in December. So Patty, over to you.
Oki, Natanako Mistamiko Samyaki. That is 2 standing headdress woman. I was very recently gifted a Blackfoot name from the place that I call home, Musagetes in Treaty 7 territory. It is the home of the Blackfoot people, the Nitsitapi, the people. Comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Ihar Stoney Nakoda Nations, comprised of the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw First Nations. It's also home to Region 3 Métis Nations. My Chinese name is Hlotngo, which stands for Bright Shining Sun. And then my English name is Patty Pon. And I say those 3 names when I introduce myself because I think it speaks to the multiple identities that we all have, the multiple ways in which people see us or perceive us to be. And of course, as IBPOC communities or people, we also know about the many, many labels, the many, many ways in which people see us that may not be true to us at all. And I think that is something that I wanted to touch on today as a funder. I am the president and CEO of Calgary Arts Development. We are the City of Calgary's municipal arm of grant investment. We are an arm's length agency. So we are a separate entity with a separate board of directors, but I have 1 shareholder, and that's the City of Calgary as represented by the members of City Council. So we sit in this in-between place and this complexity of many relations that we try to maintain and build in a good way going forward. I choose to introduce myself with my Blackfoot name first because it acknowledges that this is where I am today. It is where I come from now. It is the thing that has grounded me and rooted me. And it also reminds me that while Canada may be 150 some odd years, which is nothing in the span of time, Turtle Island is been around for time immemorial. When I received my Blackfoot name, I was at a World Heritage Site called Writing on Stone, Provincial Park, Assinipi. And it contains pictographs and petroglyphs that were drawn in the time of Van Gogh or of Michelangelo or the time before Christ, before the stories of Siddhartha and Buddha were in the midst of the global context. So on Turtle Island, we come from a place that has a long-standing history. It has roots, and it is incumbent upon us as people who live in this place to know that, to recognize that, and to honor that. And so I'm so glad, Kevin, to hear that your conversations that have taken place so far, and I'm sorry I haven't been a part of them more, have really tried to center how you see the work that you all undertake in your practice as being centered in the history and the presence of the original people who were here and who remain here, and quite honestly, will be here long past any of the rest of us settler communities, as far as I'm concerned, because they know where they come from. And so in that spirit and in that context, I just want to share a few thoughts with you. And then I think I really appreciate, Kevin, what you said, more questions than answers. We at Calgary Arts Development have been on this journey of reconciliation and what we call equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. Something we've learned from the artists in our community who are working in the realm of disabilities justice is oftentimes EDI, however you frame it, doesn't include people with disabilities. You know, even things, and I'm so grateful, and Nova, I've taken the lesson of how you started us in a physical way. That's so important. What about people in a wheelchair? What about people who have other different abilities? How might we bring them into the circle? How might we think about starting in ways that acknowledge back to those multiple ways in which we might see ourselves or identify ourselves? That's what the application and the granting process needs to do. For the better part of 60 years, 70 years, it's been a case of one size fits all, one application, so that we can be fair. And so then what happens is you have 725 different questions to try and address the 725 different ways that an artist or an organization or a community might answer that question. And then on that, and then when we recognize, oh, one size doesn't fit all, we try to be more fair and more equitable, not remembering that those are two different things. Fair is not equitable. And it's hard in dominant cultures to remember that. And so then we started to go, oh, okay, well, we'll do the hybrid application, but then you have to endure the cost of making that video and making sure that it's a good quality and making sure of all those things. Or sure, if you need help, well, you can call us to get help with your grant, but we only have English speaking grant specialists, not any other language. You know, including ASL. So, so you have to endure that cost. So we kept trying to make these kind of adjustments to an existing system that, as you all already know, is racist, is biased, is colonial in structure. It favors communities that have always been favored in all kinds of ways. And so here at CADA, which is our acronym, we try to go back to we've really tried to go back, and our intention is, while we continue to try and adapt an existing system we know is flawed, our interest is actually creating a new system that recognizes all of those things I started with earlier about our multiple identities, the different ways in which we might create content. And that's where I look forward to the conversation today, to hear from all of you how that might be supported. The other thing we're looking at, and Kevin, you just wave your hand at me when you need me to stop talking, okay? Is we need to find ways to have voices who have never been at the table or rarely been at the table to be at the table when we start talking about creating these new systems. And I can only speak from Calgary Arts Development's perspective. So I'm not suggesting this is the way for anyone else, but I will say it has surfaced great learning and humility on my part. We created in 2023, well, actually more earlier in 2020, but anyway, we have a community working group on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. It's a process that is you self-nominate or you are nominated by the community to be a part of this advisory comprised of BIPOC artists and arts workers, and advise us on a variety of issues that we bring to them, as well as inviting that community of artists to bring issues that are coming from their communities to make sure we're aware And it has turned into some interesting, heated conversations. It is not easy. It's very turbulent. But at the same time, we have come to some amazing new ways of knowing and being with each other in good relations. We also have a group that we have seeded that is called the Cultural Instigators. This is a group comprised, again, of BIPOC artists and arts makers who come from a variety of different backgrounds and communities. And CADA's only role is we provided them with a modest stipend monthly to help compensate them for the time it takes to reflect on all these things that you're describing in the conference today. They also used the time to create a grant request to the 3 orders of government in our jurisdiction, and managed to secure $250,000 as a way to address collectively how we might work differently as artists. And I would really encourage you to invite members of the Cultural Instigators to future conversations with you, and I'm happy to connect you. They are trying to raise awareness around a variety of social issues of facing the sector: mental wellness, inequity, racism, anti-Indigenous racism. Like it's quite a remarkable project that I'm very hopeful. And the thing was, is we didn't do anything. We just provided a means to just be able to keep going, right? To pay your rent. Modest, $500 a month, but we committed to them for a year. And we also made a $5,000 grant available to each instigator to undertake their own practice in some way and continue that momentum. The final 2 things I'll just tell you about in those other groups, we have had an Original Peoples Investment Program. It's a grant investment program directed specifically to Indigenous artists and crafts people. The program was created by Indigenous people. We have an advisory circle that has created the program, the assessment process, the way in which reporting happens, all of that since 2014. And it's we know there's something to learn from that process. So again, back to new systems of granting that we have never undertaken before. Cultural Instigators, CWG. And then the last thing I will just maybe share, and then I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm sure I've forgotten something. Back to being at the table. For those of us who have the power to influence, to make decisions, to control the money, all of those things, it is incumbent upon us, and I don't know if there are any other funders or other, and including actually arts organizations. One of the questions you're going to get in the application for operating granting that we will open up in 2023 is describe to us how your work is artist-centered. Describe to us how you are supporting artists in your work. Because for arts organizations, especially those that have been around for a long time, especially those that are white-led, white-centered, I'm not so sure it's about the artist anymore. I think it's become about the how do we continue to afford what we do in the way we've always done it. It's about how do we manage to keep our share of the operating grant, knowing that there are so many others who want in. It's become about that. And we need to break the back of that. And that leads me then to, for those of us in power, you have to have equity priorities. You have to be able to talk about them, and you have to be able to say them out loud. And if you can't do that, then you actually aren't on your journey yet of EDIA or reconciliation. So I think maybe that'll be my final thought for now, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Patty. I have a question for you. Because, you've mentioned so many rich, nuanced, beautiful things, and I'm really curious about this idea of what is involved for you and the Calgary Arts Council around the process. Could you walk us through what you have to do and some of the things that you have to do? I'm sure it's not all easy to really rethink what that application process is and look at how it structurally from knowing the information that you know from the cultural instigators to implementing? What are some of the things involved in that?
Well, I think, breaking down these models and these systems is not easy. It takes years. We had hunches. We've known for years. I started this job in 2013, and we knew in 2013 that the systems were biased. What we didn't have at that time was a critical mass and a momentum of recognition of just how biased so many of our systems are, especially in government. And so the biggest part of the battle has actually been being a champion for that, whether it was in the press or not in the press, whether it was really popular or not popular, our ability to just continue going through the stickiness of your commitment to the journey. And then I think the next part of it was my staff. Not everybody agreed with me. I happen to be in that position where I am the CEO. So I actually do get to say, I don't care that you don't agree with me. Here's how we're doing it. And you need people in your organization who are prepared to do that. And I say that, I glib now, but in the moment, it was really hard. Some of you may have seen there's a visual, and I'll find it, about the challenge for women of color in leadership roles and the various roadblocks that they hit. Many times I have hit that. And many times I have needed to lean on my peers, the people who are close to me, to lean on for that. So have people around you, have your cohort, have your close-knit group who understand and who you can lean on. And they aren't always people of color, by the way. Sometimes there are other leaders in the community, et cetera. And then I think what compelled us to bring the community working group, the cultural instigators, the OPIP advisory circle, which is all Indigenous, and led by an Indigenous staff member who's now a member of my senior leadership team. Oh, that's something I want to say. As well as we have a chat and chew group called Citizen Artist YYC. And again, all we did was provide them with our Zoom account so that they could have more than 30 people and a longer than half-hour conversation. So we created an account for them on our paid account, and they meet monthly. And they've had all kinds of conversations about what it is to be BIPOC in this world. And Kate is never in the conversation unless we're invited to be in the conversation. But what we do ask is, if you have things to share that we can make a change or difference on, please tell us. We will be here to hear you. So sometimes it's about letting those conversations happen, like today, without us, in the hopes that we have built trust, that you feel like you can come to us and have that conversation. And I think we've done that, so, kind of, not the best way, to the kind of my liking, but we're getting there. The other thing is, I don't want to forget that as we work to increase the presence and the status and the value of BIPOC communities, there's an existing one that happens to be the dominant culture and is primarily white-led, Western European art forms, yada, 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 call it whatever you want. And I can't, as a funder, I can't forget that. And so part of our journey is not only elevating and accelerating and raising the opportunities for BIPOC, it's also about educating and maybe sometimes inviting those other dominant culture communities to unlearn behavior, and also be present in those difficult conversations. I hope that as funders, we might help be a bit of a mediator, a bit of a facilitator between BIPOC. I have some awful stats that I can share with you. We do a diversity survey. We started in 2017. We do it every 3 years. We just finished the raw data from 2020, and it's the workplace harassment, the incidence of racism, the inequity in pay. I knew it was bad. I did not know it was that bad in Calgary. And so now I believe CADA has a responsibility. When someone comes to us with an allegation, we can't just ignore it. We have to say something and do something. And I have no idea how to do that. But I know I have power. I know I have influence. And if I'm not willing to raise it, who is? So, Kevin, I guess long-winded, we just keep learning more and more and more about how in our work, we can help affect change. But the first step for us was clarity that we knew we needed to do that and that our intention was to do that. If you can't acknowledge that and your equity priorities, then it's going to be even harder than it is. That's my final thought.
Thank you. I'm adding something radical to it. You've mentioned decision-making processes and the stickiness on your journey. And so I wanted to say radical decision-making processes are also part of what we need to be rethinking as part of the application process. And that goes against a lot of things, as I said in the beginning, around checking ourselves when we arrive in a room. Are we doing so as an individual, or are we doing so as someone with a title for an organization? And what is the balance that is involved in that? I'm mindful that Tamaj Garud from the Toronto Arts Council has to leave in a little bit. So I want to just invite her to come in here and talk about, as you mentioned, Patty, which is a great segue, is this idea around listening to community, doing consultations, and then implementing a granting or application process to support those particular things. And Tamaj has an interesting way of also thinking about the potential hybridity of an application process that I wanted to also bring into the conversation as we rethink this idea of systems of support and also, granting application processes. Tamaj?
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks for just giving us this space to chat about this. It's so important in the work that we do. And I'm so grateful to be gathered with colleagues. I wish I had more time today. I have a grant application deadline for my program coming up next week. So unfortunately, I do have to run after this. But thank you to those who spoke so far. Patty, so grateful for your insights. They were beautiful and left me with a lot to reflect on. So my name is Tamaj Garud. I am the Outreach and Access Program Manager at Toronto Arts Council. So part of my role is to support the development of our, outreach initiatives across all our programs to really take a look at accessibility, accessibility within our application process and within our programs. And I'm also the manager of a new program called the Black Arts Program. And it's the first Black Arts program by a government funder, I believe, in all of Canada. And really, really proud of how this program has come together. And I wanted to share a few things that I had learned from developing this program, working primarily with, Black artists and arts workers in consultation. It was a very, long process in bringing this work together. And I want to share some things that I learned and just the application process and how it came together. So the Black Arts Program, we have an annual operating program and a projects program. And when we first started thinking about this program, it precedes my time at TAC, actually. I'm pretty new. I just started in January. But this program was in conversation for a while. And really, there was a lot of intention and thought put into how it would come together in terms of making sure that this program was developed with the needs and insights of Black artists and arts workers in the city in consideration, but also specifically just making sure that this was more of a co-design process with community as opposed to, a funder sort of with the kind of bureaucracy and institutional power that comes with that, making decisions for artists. So we wanted to make sure that, we in acknowledging the power that there is behind a name like TAC, making sure that artists are aware that this program, the intention of this program is to be responsive to their needs, and not just to be responsive in its creation, but also long term, that this is an agile program, that this is a program that will move with community. And that's really important to how this program was designed. So I'm wondering, would it be helpful to present, because I do have some slides, would it be helpful to maybe see some visuals? I can talk, or if people prefer, maybe just let me know. I don't know if I can share my screen, but.
Sadly, that's not being operated on my end. So
Okay.
Sarah, is that possible?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Okay. All right. It's saying I can't, but if you could maybe just enable it, I'm happy to share a couple things.
Oh, Kevin, I need you to stop sharing this.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, so what we did was there was a first consultation, an initial consultation that we did, which was more of sort of assessing needs and just kind of taking the pulse of community members, really just kind of asking questions about what people need, essentially. What do you need to flourish in your art practice? What supports are you currently not experiencing that would be useful to you? How can a funding program provide you with support that could support you long term, as well as during the duration of a project that you're funded for? Part of the intention of this is to look at funding and supporting these artists, not just for the duration of their projects, but allowing that support to also sort of reverberate beyond that, for them to develop professionally, to create supports around this funding program, so that artists can also feel like they have a sort of holistic support system during that time that they're creating their projects. And this specifically is for, individual artists and collectives. Arts organizations, of course, can apply to annual operating as well. And we wanted to make sure that, we're responding to what are some of the challenges that arts organizations, Black arts organizations, are having in being able to develop, continue, and thrive. So this is just an example of a report that was created after that first consultation. Essentially, what we did is we had conversations, like focus group conversations with Black artists and arts workers. We also sent out a survey where we asked some of these questions. And what came out of it was a report, and some of it we sort of knew, and a lot of it was, interesting insights in terms of what's happening for Black artists right now in the city. What are some of the priorities that this grant needs to take into consideration? And this was facilitated by external consultants and arts workers, Paulina O'Keefe-Anthony and Kaimir Nirma Pitanta. And this report, Black Arts Funding for Black Arts Future, Recommendations for Toronto Arts Council, it is available on our website. One thing that is really important that I learned from consultation is that consultation is important, but there's also a lot of it happening that has happened already. So how can arts organizations, arts funders, anyone who's really engaging in this consultation process, share resources with each other, so we're not asking the same questions over and over, and so that people don't feel like their brilliance, their expertise is being extracted just for the sake of saying we did something, right? So how do we make this meaningful and not performative? And part of the ways that I've learned to do that is actually to also lean on other research, other knowledge, other consultations that have happened in the past. I know the city has done some things with Black-led, Black-focused Black serving with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, and looking at other funders like Toronto Foundation that had an Indigenous and Black Arts Fund, not Arts Fund. It was a granting program for organizations and collectives, not specifically arts based, but looking at how they did things and just other, key players that have done similar work. And so part of the work that we did is also looking at some of that, and learning from what some others have accomplished and some of the things that we can take away from that. That's really, really important in making sure that we're building a network of knowledge and sharing that, as opposed to just kind of reinventing the wheel each time, so that we can say that we have ownership in doing that. So this is an important piece. And that's why I really want to share this with you as well. This full report is available on our website, so you can go ahead and read it. It kind of details all of the feedback, the recommendations, the questions that were asked, and just summarizes the general kind of feedback that came out of it. Some of what came out of this in terms of priorities is that Black artists really felt that we need to focus on support focused on professional development, on mentorship, on networking, and really building community. And that sometimes the funding space can create the sense of competition that impedes that. So how do we, as a funder and as a program, encourage collaboration, encourage community building and networking, and provide resources to be able to facilitate that for artists that are a part of this program? So this is just a little bit from the consultations that were done. An overwhelming amount, 93% of artists and arts workers, Black artists and arts workers, said that they wanted to see a rolling deadline for funding. Rolling deadline meaning that there would not be one set deadline throughout the year, but applicants could apply at many points throughout the year, anytime throughout the year. And part of this was because of, the administrative burden, and sometimes the misalignment of the timelines of certain deadlines, making sure that this funding was accessible throughout the year for applicants to be able to apply throughout the year. So one participant said the rolling deadline is a good idea, but we also need to look at the ways that people can be assessed, meaning looking at how the assessment criteria is put together. Does it take into consideration some of the challenges that we're seeing in the community in terms of, what resources are available? Is there flexibility for people to really speak to some of their lived experience in terms of, if there's a new applicant that might not have like really strong support material or whatever it is, like, is there a way to be able to access some sort of mentorship? Is there a way to be able to provide questions in the application that allow people to be able to demonstrate what else they've done, things like that. So we had a lot of really interesting conversations. Not all of it can be captured in these reports, of course. Spoke to about 300 Black artists and arts workers throughout this consultation process, received feedback from those individuals. And then I know we wanted to talk about the application format. So I do want to share that this application is the first time that Toronto Arts Council is actually doing this hybrid model, where we're not only offering a written answer option, but we're also offering the option for applicants to submit an audio application or a video application. And the way that we've structured this is that applicants can actually choose each question, which format they'd like to submit in. There are a couple of questions that are locked in written that, we're looking at seeing it if there's a possibility to open that up in the future. But these are questions like the budget table and things like that. But for most of the questions in the projects and operating application, applicants can decide which format they'd like to choose. We were sort of going back and forth about, do we want to allow them to do a full audio or a full video, or is this something that, we want to create for each question? We decided to do this for each question, acknowledging that some applicants might prefer audio for one and video for another, for example. But as you can see, the majority of people said that they would, participate in some sort of a kind of a hybrid application model. 68% said that they would answer questions in video format. 43% said that they would answer in audio format. So part of the way that we made this decision is just based on what people said was necessary for them, and what people said that, would be a good feature in terms of accessibility. And what's really great about this is it also allows for accessibility in terms of, people's comfort levels, but also in terms of looking at, applicants with disabilities. We do have a couple of deaf applicants, for example, who are doing their application via video so that they can sign their answers and answer their questions in their language, ASL, right? So this is something that, again, is also providing accessibility and opening things up. And it is something that we're piloting this year. So there's some other recommendations that we had for accessibility: making sure that questions were short, concise, and clear, building strong community partnerships for outreach to further marginalized applicants. So looking at intersectionality, as you know, all of the applicants for this particular program are Black, but then also looking at, where people are living, and does that applicant have a disability or a mental illness, and how can they be supported? Application support, including grant writing, was another thing that was considered in terms of accessibility, acknowledging that a lot of applicants may not have that experience in terms of grant writing. So what we actually did with this particular recommendation is we created a partnership with Neighborhood Arts Network, and we're actually providing pre-application mentorship services. So we have 3 mentors that we're currently working with through the Mentor in Residence program at Neighborhood Arts Network, and they're actually supporting some of our applicants for the Black Arts Projects programs in completing their application and providing mentorship in general as well. Some of them are providing supports and supporting applicants to kind of flesh out their project ideas, to connect them with resources. So the pre-application support for this program is a mentorship component that we've added as well. So that's something that is kind of an additional support to this program based on some of this feedback we've received. And then also looking at, reducing some of the reporting burden on operating clients. So we've definitely lowered the reporting threshold on operating clients. They're not required to have audited financial statements, for example, in their first year. And the questions have been reduced significantly from our sort of standard application questions, so that it's more accessible to first-time applicants as well as newer organizations. And then accommodations for applicants with disabilities. We do give $500 of support for applicants that may need to hire a support person to help them to write an application. And we also have $5,000 for just accessibility needs that they need throughout the project once they receive a grant. So those are some things that have existed before within TAC as well, but also looking at some of the things that we have in place already. And that's pretty much it. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions. Again, this was really just sharing the ways in which this program in particular at TAC is responding to some of the different needs in terms of application accessibility and also needs within a program. I know Kevin mentioned looking at systems of support within funding programs as well. I did forget to mention that the Black Arts Funding Program, we have something called Black Future Studio, which is a networking space, and we're collaborating with another organization. So successful applicants can access this sort of multi-purpose studio space to do their work. They get free resources and materials to create their projects that way. We also have mentorship built into the application process, so applicants can receive a mentor as well as funding to do their project. And we're also going to be providing drop-in workshops throughout on, building art practice. So those are some of the kind of holistic supports that we've developed around this program.
Thank you, Tamaj. I'm just going to send in the chat. Does anyone have any questions for Tamaj? I think what's really interesting and beautiful in, I made a note because I was just like, wow, that'd be interesting. In rethinking like an application process, you mentioned the idea of mentorship, and I just jumped at the idea of having councils and funding bodies or systems of support actually, when someone is applying, say, you can go to Nova Bhattacharya for mentorship and support at your application process, because we know of her being successful as an artist or having an arts organization, and Nova being okay with supporting someone else getting into the system. I think this idea of mentorship and how it could work as part of the application process in artists supporting each other, supporting other BIPOC artists to arrive in the funding stream, is an interesting and really beautiful and nuanced one. And also this idea also about funding bodies, systems of support, for lack of a better word, because I do believe funding bodies are part of a system of support. They're foundations, and we could go, they're all across the country in different ways. Also taking a role in advocating differently, not just advocating for themselves in their councils or system or in their foundations of support, but advocating for the sector and for artists and for organizations in a different way. I know one of our, and I see this a lot on many conversations I have. I know one of our committee instigators is from Australia, and I always bring up the Australia Arts Council, because I think it's done its work in really thinking about what exactly is involved in the systems of support and the ways in which it can support the sector in all its ways, which includes writing on the arts, blah, 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 blah. So it's not just about the creative funding of something or the surviving of an organization, but it's also about nurturing the artistic contents that is in a different way. But I do believe that we might have to think differently about where universities and education sits within the funding and application processes if we're going to think about those particular things. Because of course we know that you cannot be a university or in any sort of intellectual settings and actually receive funding in the same way you do as in artists. It happens differently in the United States. I want to just put it out there as we rethink the models, is to rethink also then where and which ways artists are working as a living as part of their well-being as well. Is there any questions from anybody out there? No questions. I have a question.
Okay.
And the question is, what assumptions, even in this particular way of rethinking and thinking about shifting and changing and being reflexive to the need, what assumptions do you feel are being made about the ways in which persons are filling out the application or intersecting with an organization like the TAC? What assumptions do you feel that are being made in those particular ways? You mentioned words like clear, concise, and short. And I'm just saying that what exactly is involved in that? Is it word limits in an application process? Is it like what exactly is involved in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, we're looking at also taking feedback. We're going to be evaluating this first round of applications to make sure that we're doing what we're actually saying, so that, again, this application can change in future iterations of it. But what we've tried to do is we've condensed the volume of questions. So instead of having a category with, for projects, for example, with 5 questions underneath, we have one category, one question, one category for most of the categories, and then we have questions that they might want to answer, for example. So instead of, again, having a category with 5, like let's say 500 word questions, there's one category with a 700 word question and other leading questions that they might want to think of in their answer. And so that's one of the ways that we've kind of condensed it. So a part of it is word limits, but a part of it is also clarifying the questions being asked. So each question has a descriptor where they're asked those follow-up questions, or they're encouraged to think about how to approach the question. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. We were kind of also, we weren't able to roll it out this year, but something that we're looking at is also adding in sort of a video description within the application. That would also be in ASL as well for deaf applicants, and allowing that to be another way for applicants to access instructions about how to answer the question. Because I'm finding that's something that is a challenge, is that a question sometimes can be so broad that applicants are overwhelmed, but then it's really specific and sometimes has jargon in it that feels very limiting to an applicant that maybe is newer to the process of grant writing, or is even newer to their practice. So that's some of the things that we're looking at, and again, kind of engaging in this ongoing process of improving it. But so far, we've definitely condensed and made it much more clear.
Thank you. And I think there's something really magical for me about this idea of like constantly shifting the application process. And it's reflective and reflexive to what we are hearing from the artists and the arts organizations. I think there is something really beautiful in this idea of thinking about support and systems of support that becomes something that is really implemented, radical implementation at all levels of systems of support and all levels of application processes and or our funding bodies.
I do want to add,
yes.
Sorry, I do want to add quickly, I think evaluation is really important. I think it's really important to not just say, okay, well, we've consulted and now we have a program, but to continue that process, whether it's, through an advisory committee within the program, or just asking for feedback. And if you're doing focus groups, making sure you're paying people for their time, of course, so that it doesn't feel like extracting information, but making sure you're aware of how things are being received as well throughout, because sometimes people's needs change, the community's needs might change, or you think you have it right and you don't. So part of this process, I think, is also being humble and continuing to listen.
Thank you. And to end, so Raya, is it a question that you have? You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk about, and maybe this is as much a question, well, I think it's more a question for you, Timaj, but about the interface between this program and other programs at the TAC. Like, I'm wondering how the knowledge that you gather here through the application forms, how it informs what happens in the regular program, or even for that matter in terms of assessment. Like, does the assessment process function as a way for peers or like for the sector? Will there be I don't know if you might be considering a report on the first round of applications, but just so the sector can learn about what's being seen there? I'm thinking about Patty's point about mediation and education for the sector as a whole, and wondering if it's too early to ask that question.
Yeah, so we've been having conversations about that. Haven't landed on how to do it, but we are looking at doing an evaluation of how the first round of applications went, and just how the program is going, and seeing if we could perhaps add that to some of the literature we've already started with that first report. There will be a second report coming out as well about co-design and the process of co-design, looking at how we can add some evaluation, data, for lack of a better way of saying that, into that report is something that we're considering as well. But again, nothing is definitive as of yet, but there will be something coming out of this in terms of like learnings and literature.
Thank you. That was a really interesting question also, because I was going to mention your statement around, can all the funding and support structures work together? Because let me tell you, I'm Jamaica come out me tired as an artist myself to answer the same questions in 3 different versions, 5 different versions for support systems to address the same thing across different platforms. I think there's something about if we're looking at as funding bodies or as granting bodies as systems of support, to support the needs of the sector. And so I think that part of the needs of the sector in that support, and I'm going to go to Colin after this, is to really think about unifying what is funding at many levels and or support at many levels to benefit, if we're going to look at BIPOC artists, to benefit under-resourced resourced artists and organizations. And I think there's something about, can all the systems of support across this country called Canada start to have conversations, meaningful conversations about thinking about what is a collective support systems for artists and arts organizations? It's a challenge. It's a big question. And as I said before, I don't have the answers. All I have are questions. But I just wanted to put it forward because you mentioned this idea of like having conversations and talking about that, because I think that would be revolutionary as we think about how do we begin from this particular point moving forward. Let me just see what's happening in the chat. There's a question here that Patty has for everyone that we could probably take into the breakout rooms. So I'll just make note of it. And Patty, if you could also make note of it for us, or sort of breakout conversations that will happen as well. Great. Thank you so much, Tamaj. I know you have to run and you probably are over time, but I'm just grateful for to have you here and to also share with us some of these ways in which you've been thinking about you know, a reflexive and a reflective application process that is suited towards the needs of artists and arts organizations. Thank you so much. I'm gonna call in Colin.
Hello. Do you want me to just start?
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard so much. Yeah, I'm calling you in to just get into it. I know you as an organization, but also I think what's really interesting here, and I know Jacob and yourself could talk to this, is regionalization. It's access. It's being in the Yukon. It's like what are the in thinking about rethinking processes and systems of support, can you begin to talk about maybe a challenge or two, and then how in rethinking an application process it can benefit and support those in a very large country, the third largest country in the world, in these really crazy spaces? Can we begin to think about what that support could look like? Yeah, I can talk about that. I'm going to do my little intro to myself first, because I don't know half these names in this chat. Tansi, hello. My name is Colin Wolf. I am a Métis theater maker, activist, and bread baker. My mother, Karen, is Métis, and she traces her history to the Métis settlement at Lac La Biche and further back to the Red River, where the Métis people originated. My father, Mac, is Scottish, tracing his history through the muddled culture of Canada all the way back to the Scottish clan of Dingwall, a subclan of Ross. The Canadian state, an extension of the British Empire, used its tools of colonialism, imperialism, and supremacy to try and homogenize both of my parents' identities to fit the ideal of the Canadian citizen. My father's family went into this process much more willingly than my mother's. My mother's family hid, ran, and fought to stay alive. And for better or worse, my father's white skin gave him an advantage in that homogenization. My mother was never able to outrun her brown skin. My family, all members of the Métis Nation of Alberta, recognized by the Métis National Council, now identify primarily as Métis. I bring this up in order to contextualize the history that I carry even before I was born, even before I arrived, these colonial things. I'm currently serving as the artistic director of Gwandaks Theatre here in Whitehorse, Yukon, on the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Tan Quachin Council. I was born and raised in Calgary. I went to school in Lethbridge. I cut my teeth in theater all over the prairies for 5 years, working in TYA, Workers' Rights Theater, Indigenous Theater. And I left Calgary because we were struggling a lot to access funding. And that was through the Canada Council, who underfunds Alberta. That was through Calgary Arts Development, because it was a different time. And my sister and I are new, and we were half-breeds who weren't fully accepted by Indigenous people all the time. So it was quite a challenge in Calgary. We started a theater company called Thumbs Up Good Work to try and address this. And the systems of support that actually upheld us was like our aunties. It was like bake sales. It was them buying things and giving us $50 or $100. And so like, we're talking about systems of support. And I know we mean like funders and the big money and all of that, but like, there's all these underground systems of support. Like
I only started writing grants like 6 years ago, and my first one, it was so intimidating. I did not know that there were any program officers. I did not know that Calgary Arts Development had anyone to help. I think this was 2015 or 2016. And my sister and I found the application process so overwhelming. And we're two university educated graduates. Like, we went to university and we were like, frick, this is hard. We have to define our identity for this program. We have to define our program, and we have to go through this history every time because we can't not bring this history up, and it's hard. And so we gave up. We just straight up gave up on the first grant, and we just did it on our own without grants for a couple of years. And I started a gardening company, and I used the profits from my gardening company to fund our theater because I felt that was more accessible. It was easier for me to break my back and my knees than to type at a computer. I found it has shifted as I've gotten older. It is now easier to type at a computer than it is to break my back and my knees. Obviously, I'm no longer still running a gardening company. I'm running Guandac Theatre in Whitehorse. The first grant I was actually able to submit only happened because there were probably 5 people who for free helped me. And these were like white and Indigenous colleagues who had gotten grants in before. And so I think a lot, and I've been on a few calls with other funders asking like, how do we do things better? How do we help you out in the North? And it's like, we need people to actually help us, because there are people up here who help people submit grants and they're doing it for free, or they're doing it on their AD salary, which then kind of like adjusts the capacity of the company. Like, it's a lot of work up here, and like we don't have a nice municipal funder that's funding the arts. We have a recreational funder, so I have to rejig everything to be portrayed as community recreation rather than artistic endeavor, because we don't have a municipal arts funder, which is a whole nother layer of challenge that I find. I do feel like Guandac Theatre is a system of support for artists. Like, I think theaters maybe are also these systems where I feel like I spend a lot of time listening to what people want to do and what the people who are showing up at my company want to do. And then I try and find funds that work for that. And I'm actually finding a lot more success with a lot less effort in non-arts grants. The Yukon Human Rights Commission gives us money to make plays that do all sorts of stuff, and there's so much less reporting, and that is a system of support that feels like they want to work with us and they want us to make plays and do this work and go to schools and make plays for adults, but it's not arts, right? It's not arts. It's not quite the same thing. In crime prevention, like I apply for crime prevention grants because I can just write like an additional project description that says like, this is what it is in a play format, and then here's how it will address your specific things, because they have a lot more flexibility. And like one of our projects fell apart, and the crime prevention board, they brought me in and they were like, no problem, how can we help you get this sorted? Whereas I find like with a lot of other arts funders, there's no trust. I don't feel trusted by the arts funders at Guandac or as an individual. And I struggle with that. Yeah, there's a bunch of thoughts.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of thoughts there. Thank you. I'm going to probe some more, because I think you've mentioned 2 really beautiful things that would be interesting in and now shifting it from the other way. You mentioned community and the importance of actually understanding community as a support system in generating funds to do your creative practice. Could you talk about how that could be considered in an application process, or how you've communicated that in the application process? Could you speak also to the need for possibly funders to think about that particular component? Because we hear, impact, right? As an example, one of the things you're assessed on, but that impact is normally based on what's in seat in the theater in a sort of productive presented way, rather than actually impact within a community that is actually holding, lifting, and supporting you to do that particular work. Could you just talk about what is involved in that for us?
Yeah, well, something that's coming to mind with that. I just had my staff take an impact study workshop about moving away from like numbers and getting high numbers and looking at like what is our actually like clarifying what is our like community goal, and like what are we supposed to be I'm articulating it so poorly, but instead of being like, our goal is to make 40 plays and get 100 people in each play and instead of making our value like that, we set it as how do we meaningfully, like, the depth of impact rather than the breadth of impact. I'm not 100% sure how funders can figure that out. I'm pretty new to applying for funding models, as I mentioned, only 6 years experience, but yeah.
You just mentioned something really interesting as well. Depth of impact versus breadth. Breadth of impact. I think that's, wow. You should write that down. That's a beautiful, and I'm going to just make sure that I credit you for that, because I think that's actually interesting in terms of the ways in which, see, part of the challenge with, I think, an application process and a support structure that looks at the breadth of impact. It looks at amount of people. It's quantitative rather than qualitative. And I think for many BIPOC creators, it's about the qualitative part of the work. It's about the work that we know are impacting our communities and the persons that are seeing themselves represented. And that came up yesterday as well in the conversation. How are BIPOC persons and their cultural practices and their ways of being represented in work? And I'm not quite sure if many systems of support understand that as an integral part of how BIPOC artists actually approach and create work. You know, again, I could throw it back to like Nova's conversation and the way she started, right? How we started with this idea of honoring space and time through a different diverse ways of practices. How is that actually a part of the qualitative ways of building community? And how does that arrive in a grant application? How does it arrive in a system of support by presenters or by organizations as an imperative, not as a side, but an imperative in those particular ways? The next thing I wanted to talk about and ask you to dig into is trust. Trust with systems of support and granting bodies. What exactly is involved in that? What are some of the examples that you're like, oh, I don't feel like I can trust? Because I think it's important that systems of support begin to own and develop the means of trust for artists and arts organizations.
Yeah, trust. I feel I don't trust the arts orgs because it feels like, or the funders, because it feels like they don't trust me, because I get emails after I send in my report that are just straight up like, we don't believe you did this play, send us the archival. And I've never heard of that happening to other people, where a funder says, we don't believe you. And they're like, well, you didn't get any reviews and you didn't get the marketing. And it's like, well, it's COVID. So the play sold out in 1 minute. So we didn't need to do much marketing. And I didn't push for the because we only need those mechanisms to get bums in seats. And that's not the metric that I'm going on. So I didn't accumulate all these like articles and reviews and I worked on the art and the work, trying to keep the artists going through COVID. And so I got emails from 3 different funders. And one of them was before COVID, where they were like, we don't believe you. And that really broke a lot of trust for me, right? And the whole thing of like, you have to be getting grants. You have to have a confirmed fund before other funders want to fund you. And I understand it. You need confirmation, but like, who's going to take that first step on a new Métis guy who has no real connections and came from a family that's pretty marginalized, and so didn't have like an uncle or an auntie or a cousin who did theater. Like, I had no way in. I had no idea about arts funds. We didn't get access to the cool programs in high school or anything like that. So it was really like, it didn't feel like trust. It felt like, who are you? Why are you trying to join us? We are artists and we do cool art things, and you're doing some weird indigenous thing, this indigenous half-breed community thing. And it's not the indigenous thing that we get, because the indigenous thing that we get is war bonnets, feathers, buckskin, alcoholism. They don't get indigenous half-breed trying to make a new culture, right? Like, there's a modern Métis culture that's being developed, and I've tried to put this in every single one of my grants, and I don't feel like they care. And I really haven't felt a lot of trust from funders. I've felt a lot more trust from, and this comment here about about the non-arts funders seeing it as non-serious work. I just made personal connections through some very lucky circumstances with people at those organizations. And like, it was through going to like I cooked a dinner for someone who worked at the Yukon Human Rights Commission at a fundraiser, and they were like, we just got talking about theater, and I got talking about how I thought theater can have a deeper impact than what we're currently using it for. And then that was the spark of now what is like a 4-year, $100,000 partnership with the Yukon Human Rights Commission. So like, you know, so I hear that like, oh, it's non-serious, but that's because a lot of times artists are like, we don't want to do serious stuff. It's all about me. I don't want to connect with community. But it's like, I'm an Indigenous artist. My work is connected with community. Like, we are in it. It is there. So like, I hear that with that. They don't take it seriously. But I also was like, take it seriously. You know, like I had to show up in a dress shirt and put a tie on and everything. But and justify it. And I had to go to the Alberta Workers Health Center, where Gina Punchel works, and say, what is the language that you use when going to non-arts funders? And it was I see 6 new messages have popped up while I've been talking here. I'm just not looking at those. Yeah, so I feel like my lack of trust with the funders comes from, you know, it's not to be like, well, they did it first, but like that is a little bit how it feels. And I'm building more trust. I'm building more trust with new funders as I talk to them, as I meet the people, and as they are humanized. Especially, I know as an individual artist, it did not feel like the funders were humanized. It felt like they were behind a lot of walls. Now, as an AD of a company, I feel like the funders are much more present and willing to talk to me. Which, like, oh, look at how power and class works. A working class Métis artist was fully ignored, but an artistic director of the only professional Indigenous theater gets invited to all this stuff. Oh, class politics. So I think that's something as well, where like we talk about systems of support. We don't have a lot of systems of support that specifically address class, because like, again, university educated, 2 of us like broke down crying at a grant application trying to tell a story about our history. Like, so how is it going to be for people who like dropped out of high school, who are also Indigenous, who in my opinion deserve access to these things, right? Like, how are we going to remove barriers for them? Because these things are all just class barriers. We talk about racial barriers, language barriers, accessibility barriers, all these other ones. And like, what about the class barriers? What about the fact that like even poor white people struggle to engage with art? Like, oh, anyway, so the trust, I struggle with the trust. And I think there's like a disconnect from the working class that also makes me feel untrustworthy. Like when artists, oh, this is a bit of a tangent here, but when artists push for a UBI, for art, universal basic income for artists only, that really frustrates me. I'm like, no, not for artists only, for everyone, because then the artists will be affected. You're part of people, artists. You're not a special class. You're part of people. Anyway, sorry. Okay, 9 comments, 9 messages in the thing.
You know, and I can't get to reading them because I'm so engrossed by now you're alive. You're dancing around this, and I'm loving it. One of the beautiful things you mentioned is this idea of like contemporary arts practices are shifting and changing constantly. And how can systems of support actually understand that? I hear you. Look, I'm from Jamaica. I apparently didn't start in ballet. I've danced in the States, and I could tell you how many times I abstracted into contemporary dance, and it's still seen as only one thing. Yesterday, we mentioned in our conversation, you were here today, about BIPOC artists and arts organizations working in a multiplicity of things. It involves theater, it involves dance and music and all these ways, because these are the ways in which we've actually been manifesting our own identities and our creativities. And so how can that be understood in the system of support that only section, not compartmentalize you in the theater arts that is based on a colonial practice? You also talk about this idea where, you know, arts for art's sake, which is it's not what we do. There's arts, I think, for BIPOC creators is definitely about community, but it's also definitely about social activism and understanding placement in a society that now you're bringing into things, language and class politics as part of the application process or the systems that we see manifesting into what we're trying to change. How do we begin now to change and shift from that? So thank you so much. Patty, I know you had your hand up. You want to say something, and then we're going to just jump to, we're going to jump to Nova.
Yeah, actually, Colin has really answered a lot of that in terms. I had a question about the trust as well, because that's certainly something we wrestle with a lot. And we've changed our practices in the last few years. And I'm sorry that, Colin, you weren't here to help experience and help guide us in that, because what you said, we have heard a lot in this last while. I think that the one thing to note is because of people like you, we changed our relationships so that it was really about building a relationship and working at the speed of trust, rather than treating a grant as a transaction and as something that you just had to tick the boxes on. That is still really inherent, I think, in a lot of granting systems right now. And we're trying to change that. The challenge is it costs more money. We need more staff to build those relationships of trust. And so there's a constant push me, pull you about having as much money available for granting, but at the same way, if you don't provide it in a way that comes with trust and generosity, then, I don't know that it really gets anybody anywhere. The other thing I'd invite you to speak to at some other time, maybe it's a breakout question, is when you talk about reporting, how would we make it so that the applicant was able to say, and this is how I believe I can report to you in a meaningful way, and describe that to us, because again, we make all kinds of assumptions. That's my final thought.
Thank you. It's this. I don't know why I'm blushing. It's Nova. Why am I blushing? It's Nova. I just want to just introduce Nova to the conversation, and I think Nova has worn many hats. But Nova came in as an SOS. I was like, I need you on this thing because something went to my junk mail, and I was going to have another colleague, Aisha Wickham, who's from the Ontario Music Fund, come in and talk about some of the ways that they've been thinking about changing and shifting that. Nova said, yes, we're both fried from a process we were doing before this. And she came on. And the reason I'm blushing is because Nova is not just an artist that I love and adore, but Nova has also been a part of a committee at the TAC, but also president of the TAC, and I think has a large circle in the spectrum of granting processes or systems of support that she could address on any particular angle. But Nova, you've been listening patiently and probably writing that stuff down. And I would just, it's a conversation. So come on into the conversation and share some thoughts.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, Kevin sent me an SOS, and because I love and adore Kevin, I responded to that, despite all the things that we're telling ourselves these days about how we have to say no and we have to take care of ourselves and all those things. So here I told Kevin, I was like, I have no time to prepare or barely even read what this is. It will be a brain dump. And he accepted that, so thank you. And hearing everyone talk is really inspiring. And just in terms of my own background, I will share, I'm Bengali. My parents are originally from India, but where my dad was from became Bangladesh because of colonialism. Journalists on my mother's side, revolutionaries on my father's side, both having done lots of jail time for speaking the truth to power. And ironically, my name, Nova, comes from an uncle who was arrested at the age of 8 years old for crawling between British soldiers' legs and planting the Indian flag. And I say ironically because he suggested to my parents, who arrived in Nova Scotia, that in order to give me a Canadian name and to embrace this new land that they were going to, that they name me Nova. And of course, it speaks to all the systemic gaslighting and rewriting of narratives of this nation that allowed even people who fought colonizers to not realize what they were doing when they gave me the name Nova. So yes, we've lost Kevin. Is he still there? Oh no, where's my anchor? So just in terms of some of the things I'm hearing, like right now, one of the things that's really on my mind is absolutely this issue of trust, and will funders trust us, especially as my organization, which is a small organization, Simone Bro used $400,000 as a budget for a small organization. Nova Dance is less than half that. But we're about to start asking for our next set of 3-year grants from the Toronto Arts Council and the Ontario Arts Council. And in this, still working through COVID landscape where nobody knows what the fuck is going on. And, the whole, if we didn't learn in 2020 not to make plans, then we didn't learn anything. And I really want to know, I just want to be able to go into those funders and say, okay, Nova Dance just has been successful at its, first multi-year operating, and now we're going into our second cycle, and we don't know what's happening in the world. We don't know how presenters are going to be working. We don't know how touring is going to be working. So, but we know that we have artists who we can support through ongoing creation processes or ongoing training. And here are the things we know that we can do. Let us apply for this money and just give it to us, but don't make us spin around and make up a bunch of plans when nobody really knows what the future is. So really trying to find a way that the current moment can be that radical opening up and tearing up of ways we've been doing things, and say, okay, if we need to be responsive to the moment, how can we trust these organizations? And then, of course, in terms of equity, how do we find ways for the priority group organizations to immediately be able to have a leg up? I've said this to funders before, white art will not die if you stop funding it, but the communities that you are pretending to prioritize need to actually be prioritized. And whether it's any new funding that councils are negotiating from government partners automatically goes to priority groups, or when the assessment criteria is, again, how can assessment criteria right now be torn open? And when those things are happening, how can any priority group organization automatically get top-ups instead of getting the whole council's impacted, so we're reducing everybody by 10% announcement? And then also the idea of funding people, and how do we automatically build in these mentorships, when all the organizations, whether it's Indigenous or Black or artists of color, who have finally, clawed their way into the system, then give us the ability to just check a box that says, if you get this project grant, will you hire an emerging artist and give them work? Because obviously we're all overworked, we know this, we're doing all the administration, we're doing all these things. So how can we employ the artists and give them the opportunity to have a bit of stability with what we are leveraging from councils? And in terms of the application process and hybridity, it's so exciting to hear that people are thinking about those things. And I just really want the applications to stop forcing artists to intellectualize their art, especially coming from dance. I want dance artists to be able to speak to what dance does for the spirit, what dance does for humanity, not turning into academics and having to prove that somehow the trajectory of our art form has just as much relevance as culturally dominant art forms. And the last thing I'll say, because Kevin also knows that when I said I would answer his SOS that I was going to bail at 12:45, because I have my first post-COVID haircut appointment, is I want us to stop, and Patty, I don't mean any offense by this, I know why you said it, but I want us to stop talking into this metaphor of place at the table. I want to burn that fucking table down and let's cremate it. We're not just burning it as an act of aggression, we're cremating it, and we're releasing it from its function, because it doesn't have a function at this time anymore. We need to release the table and the idea of going into the colonialist construct, and how do we get to that table, or how do we build the table, or how do we bring our forks and knives? We need to find a new way of really acknowledging the place that art has in society, and that it cannot work in systems that are so entrenched in the mechanisms that are meant to oppress us and keep us down. So we need to find ways to just keep working. Like Patty, you're so inspiring how you're running your council. Please move to Ontario. And what we heard from the TAC, yes, I was the president there, and I feel like we did do a lot of things to try and be responsive to artists, but of course more can be done. And I hope that contributed in some way.
Thank you, Nova. And yeah, so yeah, sorry, it's going on. It's going on, but you must get that haircut. And so thank you for coming in and being so succinct and also just hitting those points. I think you've hit some really interesting points about how the process can be about the artist, the support of the artist and creating, and the artist creating rather than what they produce. I think part of it.
Log on my phone and keep listening to all you inspiring people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and enjoy that cut. So I think I want to open it up. To those persons who are on. I know we have a wide range of persons on the call, and I know that the chat has been alive. This is an opportunity for us to go back into some of those particular conversations and really begin to use the rest of the time until 1 o'clock. We come back in the evening for breakout sessions, for amplifying the conversations in different rooms and ways. But just, we've been talking for a while. Is there any sort of comments or any things that anyone wants to come in now, going to gallery view, and you're allowed to come on in and join the conversation? We're all experts. That's the funny part about this, is that we're all experts in what knowledge sharing and knowledge transference can be. And I think sometimes we forget that. I think the system that Nova's talking about allows us to forget that. So I want to also bring that back into the conversation, that we're all experts and we're all here to learn from each other, but also here to amplify those conversations and also rethink what systems of support can look like. Silence is also conversation.
I've got something. I've got a little nugget. It's sort of, Patty, I fully emphasize on the, like, it's the funding, right? Like, you have a set amount of funding from your city council, and you get a letter that says fund things, like do stuff, right? Like there's a thing there. There's a relationship to the city government, and same with the provincial funder. There's a relationship to the provincial government, and strangely, with the federal funder, there's also a relationship to the federal government. Almost like our way as artists of influencing that is actually applying pressure politically to people and to things and to ask for more funding, right? If we can get more funding to our arts organization, to our arts funders, we can access more funding. And so I have a little bit of a thing that I always talk about. I'm just going to hit enter on this thing that I typed up. I really encourage artists to be political and use the tools they have to apply pressure to the various levels of government to increase funding to the arts. I'm currently petitioning the Métis National Council and the Métis Nation of Alberta to create a fund for modern cultural activities, because they don't have one. Citizen artists in Canada have the power to apply pressure, but I believe the self-abstraction from the working class that many artists are able to attain prevents building of real solidarity and community with those outside of that elevated artist class. So this is how, like, you know why, like, oil riggers in Alberta, like, don't like us? It's because we don't have solidarity with another working class. Even though oil riggers are part of a big structure that's destroying the earth, so are we. Ta-da! Artists are too. We're on Zoom. We send emails. We use plastic. Like, it's like, okay, so are we. So I actually think that, like, there's some solidarity that can be built, and some pressure that we can apply at the federal and at the provincial and the territorial and the municipal level. And I don't know all the mechanisms of this, because it's going to be different in different places, and it's going to be different for different people. But I think that it is a thing that we can do to increase those systems of support, because we all want the same thing, right? The funders want plays to happen, the theaters want play, or the funders want art to happen, the organizations want art to happen, and the artists want art to happen. That's all. Mm-hmm. Nugget complete.
And thank you for that nugget. I think there's I call it privilege in the way I think about also my own artistic practice, but also how I think about those intersections, right? As you said that, I realized that in America, funding plays out differently. And there's a thing around foundation funding primarily, rather than dependence on, like, arts council structures that is actually tied to government. And so I do hear that importance of like lobbying, artists being at the center of lobbying in a different way. I'm also mindful that in most educational institutions, I'm talking about dance training processes, etc., artists are not taught about the process of systems of support. They're not taught about arriving in spaces where they're lobbying for their art, but they're taught to always complain about systems of support and funding. So I'm also encouraging this idea of shifting, and that's why these sort of conversations are beautiful for me, because here you are, Colin, you're mentioning these very, very same things that I think if we can think about the systems of support, whether that's in education, of our preparation for artists arriving into a system of funding and or granting and application process, then we're able to begin to think about the shifts that are required within the sector and the ecology itself. And sometimes it's not just in the funding model, it's also about the implications of those particular shifts on from the knowledge perspective of the artists and or the arts organizations. And I'm saying that to say that I've seen it in so many ways. I can bring in case in point, what do they call? I'm gonna say Caravana, because you know what, it will always be Caravana. FMC, bringing in the most revenue for the province in Ontario and receiving 1/6 of that particular revenue in funding. Huge misbalance, right? And we could talk about all mismanagement of budget, but those are all very Eurocentric things that we've been talking about, right? It's look at the math of that and the impact that it has on all these creators, all these band makers, all these artists that are actually employed as part of that particular system. So all art is political. You see my face? I'm not even a smile. All art is political. And the reason all art is political, and I think it's important for artists to understand that as an impact on their well-being and their livelihood, is because if it comes down to them getting paid and having a livelihood that is based on something that comes down from cultural policies in the government and different municipal structures, they are directly implicated. Now, I'm not saying they could have the same set of activisms in that, but all art is political. My body is political, your body is political, all art is political. And so it's the same thing like saying also that art for art's sake. There's no such thing as art for art's sake. Art is for a sake, it's for something. And I'm pushing back and also opening that particular conversation, because if artists do not understand where those things are coming from, they do not understand the investment in themselves. And that's part of the challenge we're having in rethinking the system of support, is for artists to have an understanding of the investment in themselves. We hear Colin talk about it very succinctly, about being educated and not having this sort of relationship with the granting structure. So I just want to push back to say that. And I say that as well to say, I'm not quite sure Shannon can come in, but Shannon Litzenberger is a part of this conversation. And you mentioned policy, and Colin also mentioned policy. And I want to challenge that cultural policy impacts funding policies. And when I say I'm a Canadian artist, half the room will go, but I hear an accent. No, where are you from? And I pay taxes in this country that is then divested into the cultural policies for which does not reflect me. And I'm saying that to say that as a director of a company, I've been locked out of funding because I chose to present at the most prestigious Caribbean Arts Festival, because we're the presenters there. Right? But at that festival, we were a part of the first contingent of non-Caribbean artists with Caribbean background. And we brought 120 persons. and we were not funded. Community played a part. So I'm also saying that to say that cultural policy in this country is also where we need to think about shifting and changing it, so that way it can affect funding policies, and then everyone in community can feel that they're represented in presenting, creating, access, et cetera, et cetera.